Hankali, which as everyone knows is Hausa for Achtung, Achtung. But what I hear you cry is Hausa. Well, dear listener, it's a language spoken by around 63 million people in West Africa, principally in southern Niger and northern Nigeria. And now I hear you ask, but why, Al? What relevance does this intriguing linguistic information have to the well-known popular podcast known as We Have Ways of Making You Talk? Pray tell us, James Holland.
Well, it's an interesting one. We have one of our listeners to thank for this, Andrew Walker, to be precise. And Andrew got in touch to say, Hankali, hashtag We Have Ways. That's Achtung in West African language Hausa at Al Murray at James 1940. I hope you can feature the 82nd West African Division in Burma as one of your forgotten armies. They fought in unbelievably hard conditions and were almost completely forgotten even by the time they got home. Well, he's absolutely right. And again, it just goes to show the kind of global reach of World War II. So the two divisions, it was originally the West African Frontier Force.
Yep.
And of course, Britain had some possessions in West Africa. And with the closure of the Suez Canal, once Italy was in the war and everything, actually West Africa became quite important. It was really important that we didn't lose hold of that because, of course, there's all that shipping now going to South Africa all the way around to India and up to Egypt and so on. And a chap called General Gifford was put in charge of all West African forces. He'd seen service in East Africa, in the East Africa campaign in 1941, and done okay. And so he's then put in charge of West Africa, and he was the guy who organised in the West African Frontier Force into two divisions, the 81st West African Division and the 82nd West African Division. And actually it's the 81st that goes out to Burma first, and they're in place by the beginning of 1944, and they are on the eastern flank, the left-hand flank, at the Battle of the Admin Box, which happens in February 1944, when basically the Japanese make a sort of a kind of thrust before their main attack up towards Imphal and Kohima, and they actually surround the 7th Indian Division.
Yep.
And the 81st West Africans are on the flank of that, and obviously British and Slim win that particular scrap.
Yeah.
And the 81st West African go into action in the follow-up in the Arakan offensive in March 1944. The 82nd don't go out until May 1944, and they first go to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and then they finally go into action at the end of 1944 in the 3rd Arakan offensive. And actually they do pretty well. They do all right.
So, I mean, this is this an army with British officers and African men?
Yes,
because the Indian army, but by the time we're talking about it, we have Indian officers, and we have, in fact, that they've sort of Slim and the co have given into the idea that they're going to have Indian officers, and that also then is going to be a political question going forward, because Indian independence is a very big question mark, and you've got to mobilise men to fight for the British Empire that they want to leave. So that is this what's happening in these African regiments as well, or is it sort of a for want of a better word, like a downscaled situation for the actual African men? Are they mercenaries? That's if you want. I mean, what are they fighting for?
I suppose they are. I mean, they are at the time British subjects. They are part of the British Empire. But they're not about to. I mean, as we all know, the end of the empire died by the 1960s, and those countries got their independence and stuff. But it's not on the horizon the same way that it is for India, which will happen in 1947, of course. And also don't forget, these are new divisions.
Yeah,
so it's not like the Indian divisions where they've been fighting literally all, since before the war on the Northwest frontier and stuff. So there isn't that kind of sort of urgency to get African officers in. So there they are. Griff Rhys-Jones' dad was one of the officers.
Really?
I seem to remember. I remember watching a program of him. I think his dad was in the 81st. But yeah, they were British officers.
Because we've talked an awful lot about the Northwest Europe campaign. The difference in Burma is this is empire on empire conflict, isn't it?
Yes.
It's the Japanese empire that's basically not really an empire, it's trying to be one.
Yes.
Coming up against the biggest and at the time oldest empire in the world.
Yeah.
And so the British are mustering all their imperial stuff from all over the world. And the Japanese have, of course, there's a component of Indian soldiers fighting the Japanese, There's the Burmese Free Army or whatever it's called. That Aung San Suu Kyi's father.
Yeah, Aung San.
Set up.
I've just read a really, really fantastic book actually about Burma by a chap called David Eimer, and it's a kind of sort of history of Burma and a travelogue. So it's told now.
Yeah.
And of course, the Arakan, which is where the 82nd and the 81st West African divisions are in action, is now Rakhine State. This is where the Rohingyas are.
Yeah.
And you literally just cannot get there because the government don't want you to go there because they don't want to see the fact that they're enacting a huge ethnic cleansing program to get rid of all these Muslims. Most of the Muslims came from India and Bangladesh. What's now Bangladesh, what was Bengal, brought over by the British during the 19th century as kind of extra workers and stuff, and fought on behalf the muscle men, as they were known. The Muslims fought on behalf of the British very, very successfully in the Arakan campaign. So there's a whole load of sort of bitterness about that. And Aung San was actually in favour of the Japanese to start off with, until he realised they were even worse than the British by a factor of about 1 million, and quickly changed sides at the end of the war. But the whole thing was an absolute, has become an absolute mess. But to go back to the 82nd West African Division, actually, they fought pretty damn well. And they were part of 15 Corps in that third battle. And, whenever you come up against the Japanese, it doesn't matter how kind of emaciated they are. It doesn't matter how kind of, bad they are. But because they're kind of fanatical, because they're just ordered to just keep fighting until they're all dead. The fighting that you do you do get involved in is always going to be beastly and violent and horrible. And actually, they suffered something like, I think, about 2,500 casualties in a division, which of a fighting force of a 15,000, 16,000 man division, 10 to 11,000 men. For 2,500, that's 25% casualties. That's quite a lot.
Because the pattern of fighting in fighting the Japanese once 14th Army sort of mastered it, is that you can break up their attack, you can break up their counterattack, but actually winkling the individuals out of the places they've decided to make their last stand is costly, and there is no
alternative to the full frontal attack.
There's no other way of doing it. You've got they're not going to surrender, so you've got to go in and kill them in one by one.
Yes, and you have to infiltrate, and that means you have to infiltrate, and you can work your way around, but you've still got to. When I say the full frontal attack, you've still got to get to those bunkers. And there is ultimately no alternative other than blasting them and attacking them and boots on the ground and actually getting up to these bunkers and getting close enough to lob in grenades and flamethrowers and all the rest of it. It's a really, really horrible business, but they fight incredibly well, and they do catch a Bufidong, which is a town that's sort of been exchanged several times. And they open up the Mondor Bufidong Road, which is this key road, which has basically been fought over for kind of 3 years, and it's a sort of key access point. And the 82nd West Africans do that, so they perform pretty damn well, frankly. And what a long way from home.
Yeah, well, brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Now that's a good question. You see, you ask us a simple question: could you please feature and look what happens? Verbal diarrhea. Right. Okay. But
always happy talking about Burma.
No, of course. Now, James, since we last broke podcast bread, you've been omnipresent on our screens. I had to turn my television off. Right, James Holland in my bloody living room again. But scrubbed up well, nice suit.
Thank you.
Nice of you to make an effort for the television. But
actually, it was a bit of a nightmare because on last Thursday, we had to we were presenting from Bayeux, and we were on this coach, and we were supposed to be. It had been arranged that we had complete passes through the roadblocks, which were extensive, and I have to say far more effective than anything that 21st Panzer had managed on D-Day itself. And so me and Dan Snow had to run from one side of Bayeux to another. And as you can imagine, in my three-piece wool suit, which might look quite spivvy, but when you're running is not great. Got there with 3 minutes to go before
because I watched the coverage from Portsmouth on the 5th, and I thought it was particularly well done, and
apart from the air fly past.
That's because the RAF has taken the idea of the few quite literally, and they've only got
it was just awful.
They've literally only got a few planes.
I'd literally just before that been talking about the fact that the Allies had 10,600 aircraft on D-Day itself, and then this kind of absolutely pathetic kind of fly past go by. I thought, well, why did they do that? Why didn't they just put the Battle of Britain Memorial flight out?
Yes, it was odd that
in entirety.
It was odd.
And swing round a couple of times. And everyone had been really happy.
Yeah.
I mean, where was the Lancaster?
Yeah.
Anyway.
I don't know that. I'll go check their manifest. I thought that. I mean, it was very interesting that they did David Haig's play about the excerpts from that about Stag.
Yes,
and that we had the F-bomb during international Second World War commemorations.
Yeah,
I mean that was a striking moment
in front of the Queen.
In front of the Queen. Although there's that great story about when the King and the Queen came to inspect First Airborne Division, a bloke got his fingers caught in a hawser when they opened the door when they're getting a jeep out, and he went fuck like that, and all these officers ran around going, "Oh, that didn't happen, Mom." Anyway, the point is, I thought that was really good that they did that,
yeah,
because there's something about Donald Trump sat there watching Ike Eisenhower making an actual big proper life or death decision, and having to listen to experts and everything. That's quite gratifying.
It was very weird looking across and going, my God, that is the Donald. There he is. And he did look very orange, and his hair looked gingerer than I thought. I thought he was blonde, but he was definitely orange. And the item about Bill Millen. That was nice.
I confess I had something in my eye during that. I thought that was particularly poignantly done.
Oh my God, I had something. I was, we're all known, of course, being British for having a straight bottom lip, but it was...
Straight bottom lip?
Sort of
stiff upper lip.
Stiff upper lip then.
What's wrong with your face, James?
Stiff upper lip. But it was wobbling then when Theresa did her letter.
Yeah,
her last letter. It was really moving.
And the thing is, because we talk every week about this history, and quite a lot of it in the abstract, and I don't think we do chaps on maps, which is the thing that that is a criticism you can level at military history, and I do think we try to make it personal. But I really felt watching a lot of the coverage. Sometimes I get quite ambivalent about commemoration and they were all heroes and all that sort of thing. And, there's that Harry Billings who was on BBC Breakfast who went, "Oh, no, I was no hero. The heroes are all dead," and all that sort of thing, which was incredibly moving and made me think, why am I interested in this? What's the point in being interested in this? Do you know what I mean? And I felt some of it leaves me feeling ambivalent. And obviously I grew up in a kind of Victor comic boy's own action man airfix era, and which sometimes makes me think, how seriously do I take this? How actually how much do I understand of suffering that people went through and the things that were asked of people? And that's the whenever there's a big commemoration like this, I come away feeling very ambivalent about my interest in the Second World War, because it's a horror story from start to fucking finish, the whole thing. The Normandy campaign is a horror story, like of the worst kind imaginable. And reading about, because I've been reading about Hill 112 since which is a bit that doesn't get talked about. We always asked about Goodwood. Every week someone will ask us about Goodwood. And up the road there's Jupiter going on, and all these other, and Charnwood and Epsom and all these other actions that don't get the sort of that don't have the controversy points of Goodwood. And Jupiter is a horror show. There is no other way of describing it. It's a meat grinder.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
And okay, the Germans are written down and destroyed as a fighting force. And you can read this dispassionate things as it's a tactical loss for the Allies, but a strategic win. What that means is loads of people getting killed and loads of people being mutilated. And
the Allied way of war was that you use firepower as much as you possibly can, but unfortunately you've got to get the Germans to counterattack, which they always do with Pavlovian regularity.
Yeah.
And so how do you get them to come out of their foxholes and actually expose themselves so that you can then absolutely grind them up with your firepower? And the only way you do that is with armour and infantry.
Yeah.
And so those frontline infantry units, although they're actually, in terms of numbers, boots on the ground, you're talking about comparatively small numbers, the casualty rates are absolutely horrific. But I'll tell you what my take on the D-Day week, which I have to say was, and I don't want to sound all kind of sort of too wanky, but it was the most extraordinary privilege to be part of it all.
I can only imagine.
To witness it. It really was very, very special. And I think it's one of a couple of things. I think the first thing is that you and I have lived with this generation all our lives. They've always been there. The Second World War happened before we were born, but we've always known these boys. They were and girls. They've always been a part of our life. But now they're in the twilight. They are really dwindling. They're seriously old. They're kind of in their 90s.
Yeah.
And we all know that another 5 or 10 years, they're going to be gone. That will...
There'll be a hairy patch of the Second World War.
There'll be a hairy patch. And that is a big moment. And everyone is just sort of desperate to hold on to them. Everyone knows that. And we're kind of nostalgic on a whole host of levels. We do think of them as the golden generation because it was however murky it got in the middle of the war, it was still a justified war.
Yeah.
And so I think we do venerate them in a way that we don't even kind of... Other combatants and other people from history, they are the special generation because they were in the Second World War against Nazism and some nasty things. And so we're desperate to hold on to them. We don't want to let them go, and we want to relish them while we've got the chance. And suddenly, I was on the Boudicca with 300 veterans. I was doing a talk at the Normandy Institute just outside Saint-Mary-Église on Tuesday last week to 100 veterans, of which, half were American, the rest were British, and there were actually a few Germans as well, which was interesting. But so you really want to sort of cherish them. The second thing is the backdrop to this, which is all the shit that's going on around the world at the moment. Trump, the rise of nationalism, all this kind of stuff, polarization of people, the kind of total division that we find ourselves in the UK at the moment, and elsewhere across Europe. And it sort of makes you think about all this stuff I think, first of all, I think everyone was really relieved to just not be talking about the B word for a few days. But at the same token, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, wow, what does this mean? What were they all fighting for? And there's two narratives. The Brexiteer narrative is that, this is what we fought for so that we don't have to kind of,
answer to anyone.
The other one is we fought for it so that we could liberate Europe and so everyone can enjoy the freedoms. It was really interesting that after the Bayeux cemetery thing, I finally got my way back to Arromanches, the sort of world's biggest party going on, the whole of Arromanches, hundreds of vehicles on the beaches. There were people of every nationality, including Germans. I met a German girl who was dressed in British kit. It was fantastic. I had a really interesting conversation with her. But there were Swedes, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians, Americans, Canadians, Brits. Literally everyone. People dressed up in living history stuff and vehicles, but everyone having beers and drinks and a party. All the veterans treated like total rock stars. I mean, there was a whole load of veterans that were kind of just walking down the main drag in Arromanches, by the car park between, where the museum is.
Yeah.
And everyone clapping them. It was just totally brilliant to witness. And I thought, this is what you fought for, mate, because, everyone's just doing what the hell they want. Yeah. It's great. There's no oppression. There's no restrictions on press. You can have a party in the middle of the street on a Thursday in June.
Yep.
What's not to like?
Yeah.
And I think it's those two things. I think that's what's, because it was pretty poignant 5 years ago in 2014. But it was even poignanter.
It's got
this week.
Even poignanter.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, it threw up loads of emotions, and also it sort of made me think. Because I'll be honest, I've struggled with my interest in the Second World War. There was a time where I thought, for God's sake, be interested in something else, you muppet. Find something else to be interested in. And at one point, tried to put it to bed. And then you see a thing like the commemoration last week, and I know in the end I can't. And it's got me. There's nothing I can do about it.
But isn't it the human drama of it all?
Of course it is.
That's the thing that gets me.
Yes, of course it is. But I know where it came from. I know it came from making model Spitfires, and all that. Anyway, we have some questions. This is from a British politics teacher who asks, says first of all, loving the podcast, gents, which is largely why this is being read out. Did 21 Panzer reach the coast between Sword and Gold late on D-Day before retreating?
Not quite. They almost got there. This was Opel Bronikovsky, who was one of the regimental commanders on 21st Panzer, and he had a whole load of tanks, and they were badly split up. They'd been sent on the eastern side the night before, and then they had to kind of sort of completely realign when they realised what was going on. So when I say the eastern side, they've gone to kind of take on the airborne, 6th Airborne that have landed. Yep. And they do this twice, the Germans. So they send off the mobile reserve of the 352nd Infantry Division towards the American airborne and the Titanic, Operation Titanic, which is the dummy parachutists and stuff. They go off after that. And 21st Panzer Division goes off after the 6th Airborne. Yeah. And I always think this is, okay, certainly the 352nd, this is the decision of General Eric Marks, who's generally considered to be, a brilliant commander, hugely experienced and all the rest of it. And I kind of think he should have known better, because there were lots of really bad German commanders, but Marks is generally considered to be one of the good ones. But he should have known, since the Germans were the inventors of airborne operations, that these are coup de main operations, and they always are going to kind of precede a bigger effort.
Yeah.
So, keep your powder dry, mate, and counteract the main invasion, which is inevitably going to follow. And it's amazing that Marx doesn't do that. And it's exactly the same with Feutinger, who's the commander of the 21st Panzer Division. He's got more excuse because he's just a fat Nazi who's seeing his mistress in Paris that night and hurries back and makes that decision. It's a really bad one. And what that means is that Opel Bronikovsky has got to move his entire division. He can't get through Caen because it's too complicated and it's too clogged. Yeah. And they're trying to moving all the civilians out, and the Germans are moving out of Caen anyway. So he then has to do this incredibly long-winded march order south of Caen and around, and then starts moving down. But laying in wait for him are the Staffordshire Yeomanry.
Yep.
It was run by the commander is a chap called Edie, who was part of the Bass family. So they have on their caps, and their emblem is the old Bass beer red triangle.
Yeah.
And they're waiting for them, and they launch an ambush, which is far more effective than anything that Wittmann does at Villa-Bocage a few days later, and absolutely hammer them.
Yeah.
Then, just as they're pulling back, just to really kind of put the willies up them, more parachute drops come in, and Opel Bronikovsky sort of reckons that retreat is a better form of valour and skedaddles. And that's
the second lift at sort of 9 o'clock in the evening,
exactly.
Isn't it? Which is the remaining components of 6th Airborne, because you've had 3 parachute battalions and the coup de main party, the first lot at midnight, ish.
Yes.
And then all of the glider element of 6th Air Landing Brigade turn up in their gliders that evening, don't they? Yep. And there's stories of Germans throwing their rifles away when they see that happen, because they think, well, we can't beat this.
Yeah.
Hundreds of gliders turning up. Yeah. You've had the invasion in the fleet in the morning, and then this in the evening. It's sort of really ramming home the point that what you're up against. Okay, right. Jimmy Gregory asks, did anyone? So the answer is no, they didn't. They didn't get to the coast.
They got close, but they didn't get quite.
Yeah.
Not close enough.
Did anyone ever get to the? Jimmy Gregory asked, did anyone ever get to the bottom of why several of the code names involved in D-Day appeared in the Daily Telegraph crossword in the months preceding the invasion? Now, this is a sort of well-known kind of pub quiz question thing.
Yeah.
That Omaha and Utah and they turn up in the Daily Telegraph crossword.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I don't know anything about this.
I don't know, nor do I.
I mean, I know of the story, but I don't know.
No, I know the story, and I think, and it's some English teacher in a public school or something. But that's all I know. So if anyone could actually direct us towards the answer to this, because here's the thing. We don't know everything. I know it's hard to believe, dear listener. We don't. I mean, the cut of our jib is that we might. But anyway, it's time for a break. But before we do, here's a splendid piece of correspondence from Lydia Jane, who I'm delighted to welcome to the community as a new listener. She says, listening to #WeHaveWays with @Al Murray and @James1940 for the first time, can confirm bugger's muddle is my new favourite expression. Excellent. We'll be back in a moment with more inappropriate nonsense shortly. Welcome back. Willkommen zurück to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. I don't know if that's right. We absolutely, it's just back. It was Zurich. Anyway, don't worry about it. We absolutely love all your correspondence. Please keep getting in touch with your questions, observations, stories, and yes, corrections. But if you do know the D-Day crossword story, please let us know. We read literally anything, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. Now, how about this one from Ben Johnson, who I assume is not the disgraced former 100-metre champion?
Or indeed the poet.
Or the poet. Yeah, of course, the poet. Right. If D-Day never happened, when would the war have ended and how? #WeHaveWays. Now, that actually leads us quite directly to this that was posted on D-Day on the 6th of June from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Russia Twitter account at @MFA_Russia. #Zakharova. And it reads, the Normandy landings were not a game changer for the outcome of World War II and the Great Patriotic War. The outcome was determined by the Red Army's victories, mainly in Stalingrad and Kursk. For 3 years, the UK and then the US dragged out, opening the second front. And a picture of the Normandy landings there, though, even though they're disregarding them. Now, Well, what do you make of that, James?
Well, not a lot, if I'm completely honest.
Yeah.
I mean, we're engaged in multiple different ways. And what you have to understand is that the Western allies are fighting a far more efficient war than the Red Army is. Vast numbers of boots on the ground is not a good way to fight a war, because what tends to happen is you have much, much higher casualties, as they discovered.
But this is the thing, because Stalingrad is basically Tunisia is happening kind of, around about the same time. So the amount of people captured
was greater. And also the amount of equipment that was captured in Tunisia was greater than the amount of equipment that was captured at Stalingrad by quite a large margin. Don't forget that the Axis forces in Tunisia are still fighting war on air, land and sea, whereas opposite at Stalingrad, they're just basically fighting to all intents and purposes, a land war by that stage. Yes, the Luftwaffe involved, but not a huge amount. And, don't forget, we're also hammering German industry, which has a knock-on effect to what's going on the Eastern Front with our air power, which is quite a sensible way of using your assets. And actually, it's really interesting because I read a comparatively recent book that's just come out called How the War Was Won. And I think he's American. He's called Phillips O'Brien. And it's really interesting. And he argues, and I've got to say he argues very convincingly, that actually in terms of material damage to the German war effort, the Western Allies caused more because of the air campaign and because of the completeness of the campaign and because of the Battle of the Atlantic and all the rest of it. It's just, I just don't understand why the Russians keep going on about this in this same sort of way. And people always make this terrible assumption that boots on the ground equates to strategic importance. Now, no one would deny that the Battle of Britain was a battle of enormous strategic importance. No one would deny that the Battle of Guadalcanal in the South Pacific was a battle of enormous strategic importance. And yet the number of combatants was actually, compared to what comes later on in the war, is comparatively small. The two just don't go together. And what the Allies are doing is this steel, not flesh policy of using technology, modernity, global reach, modern science to do a lot of the hard yards.
Because the old formulation is time, blood, money. So it's British time. The British supplied time to the Second World War. The Russians supplied blood, and the Americans supplied money. It's the sort of pat. Yeah, it's not quite right.
It's not right.
It's not right because also
it's sort of pithy and glib and actually sounds good and clever and smart, but actually isn't. It's a shortcut for kind of Kursk, not really going into it properly.
Because Kursk, this brand new research on the Kursk battlefield. Ben Wheatley's done this.
Yeah, I've just got it on your recommendation.
Prokhorovka, I think is how you pronounce it.
Yes.
Which is where's the famous tank ditch, 5th Guards tank army. And the Russians have always told this story that Kursk is this massive encounter where the Germans suffer a shattering defeat. Now, the Germans and lose all sorts of material and 500 tanks or something. But Prokhorovka, they've got a Luftwaffe overflight photos of the battle. And it's quite a confined area. It's not a big area.
It's not a big area compared to the whole of the Kursk.
Exactly. And it's like, and it's not 500 German tanks destroyed by the 2,000 Russian tanks. It's 25 German tanks and hundreds of Russian tanks. And yes, there's a victory at Kursk, but it's not the kind of victory I'd want to be involved in much because the infantry casualties are 5.6 to 1 is the casualty ratio. So for every German soldier killed, it's 5.6 Russians killed. I mean, you can call that a win if you want. I mean, the other thing, I think, and you could argue, and thank God for that, because if the Russians had been tactically more apt, that's the opposite of inept, isn't it?
I suppose so, yeah.
That they'd have been in Paris by the end of 1944. You know what I mean? If they'd got their shit together, and if they'd figured out a way of beating the Germans the way that the Western Allies did, God knows what. Because the game, the Normandy landings were not a game changer for the Allies. Yes, they were, because it meant we got to the Allies. Western Allies got to Paris. They got to Antwerp. They got to Brussels. They got to Amsterdam. They got into Germany, and you have Western presence in Western Europe, which wouldn't have happened. And if they'd not been fighting like in Stalingrad and Kursk, you'd have Red Paris. You'd have had Russian boots in Calais, which is of course the great nightmare, isn't it? at the end of the war that might happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And the alternative to that is using atomic weapons, which is what the Manhattan Project is for in the first place.
Yeah.
So either way, it's a really, really bad outcome.
Churchill's running feasibility right at the end of the war, isn't he? He's going, what if we have to fight the Russians? Can we do it? What do we do?
Yeah.
And they put together a sort of, there's a feasibility done on it. And do you recruit German divisions to help and all this sort of stuff, which is
the truth is
terrifying prospect.
Is yes, we could have done. Everyone was tired and didn't want to, which is why we didn't. But yes, we could have done, and we would have won because we have superior firepower to them, but by a country mile, and we have far greater air forces, and we have control of the skies, which the Russians wouldn't have. So. Yes, we would. It would have been brutal and bloody. I mean, what is really interesting when you look at, by 1943, Kursk is the start of the deep battle.
Yeah.
So they're having this complete revolution after the purges in the late 1930s, where they've just got rid of, and they have such an embarrassment in Finland, the Red Army, where they perform really badly. And they've got to kind of relearn everything, and the commanders that haven't been purged in the late 1930s have to kind of sort of emerge. This is your Konyevs and Chukovs and Rokossovskis and all the rest of it. They have to emerge and sort of prove themselves, which they do by 1943, and particularly Rokossovsky. And the deep battle, so what they do, and what they do for Operation Bagration, which obviously starts on 22nd of June 1944, is they amass vast amounts of men, firepower, tanks, artillery pieces, and all the rest of it. And they just go, they kind of like swing back on a kind of sort of ball on a chain and just go, bam, straight into the Germans. Take just spectacularly large casualties, and then they run out of steam after about 6 weeks, and then they have to stop for another 3 months until they can build up, create another 80 divisions, and start the whole process all over again. And so what you see with the Allies is you see offensives, but you see a sort of general sort of just a constant sort of grinding forward all the time. They're never stopping. A broad front, and just a constant pressure all the time. Whereas with the Red Army, they have a different way of doing it, which is doing this kind of sort of big punch, pause, recuperate, big punch. I mean, Operation Bagration, I think they lose something like 750,000 men.
Yeah.
750,000 men. I mean, it is unbelievable. And since they only start with kind of, whatever it is, 1.6 million men, that's over 50% casualties.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. I can't quite remember the statistics, so don't hold me on it. But it's that kind of sort of range. And, every which way you look at it, that is not an efficient way to fight a war.
No.
But the point is the Russians, compared to everybody else, have got infinitesimal kind of resources in manpower. And they don't care about the lives of their men. Well, also, if they come across a minefield, they just send them across it until there isn't a minefield anymore.
You've also got, because of the politics, you've got like a good news culture. So you've got to report back to your boss and go, it's going incredibly well, and the enemy's under massive pressure, and you can't tell the truth. You can't say you can't. And the Germans have also got that going on. So you've two totalitarian states where no one is actually telling the truth to anybody. So it's the poor old. I mean, this makes when people talk PBI, they talk about poor bloody infantry in the British Army. I mean, this is a Russian tank crews. They had 400,000 men. Totally trained as Russian tank crews, 300,000 killed.
Killed. I know, it's unbelievable. I mean, no one should doubt the
only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving as a Russian tanker. I mean, that is completely off the scale.
But
compared to the
what
West.
I was going to say is that no one should doubt the enormous courage and just grim kind of grinding on of the Red Army troops. I mean, they're just absolutely phenomenal. They deserve our respect, and they're fated. But the point is, it's always it's kind of one or the other, and I don't think you should see it in those terms.
No,
it's not a question of kind of one-upmanship. It's a question of it's a complete effort.
So this idea that the Normandy lands were not a game changer for the outcome. I mean, the reason they call it they don't call it World War II. They call it the Great Patriot War, of course, the Russians, because they lost the first one. Right. Now,
I've got another one here.
You got another one?
Another D-Day one. Love the show. Thank you very much. This is from Chris Leonovich. Did the Allies have a plan if the Germans counterattacked successfully on D-Day and we failed to establish a beachhead? A second invasion? Would it have eventually happened, just with more bloodshed? Thanks.
Well, Robert Oppenheimer was working on that, I think is the answer to the question. Isn't it? It's the atom bomb. That's your next... That's your next roll of the dice if the Normandy landings don't work. I expect I could have had to quit would have had to resign.
Famously, he wrote his
famous letter. Yeah, I mean, the Normandy has to succeed. D-Day has to succeed. There's kind of no other. It's an interesting counterfactual, an interesting idea. But we've been talking about it already. You look at the decisions having to be made by the Germans on the ground. It's 3/52. They don't know what to do. They split their effort in two. They don't meet the main effort from the Allies because there's five beach landings going on. There's no way they can meet all of those.
My argument about that was they're just committed too early.
Well, exactly. But the point is they don't. They don't have the resources to meet what they're facing.
No.
And so I don't. It is an interesting question if the D-Day landings have failed, but the Germans didn't have the means at their disposal to make them fail. And this is
I mean there is from the Allied commander's point of view, put yourself in their shoes. I mean there is just a huge amount of jeopardy because there are so many things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
Not clearing enough mines from the channel.
Yeah.
Not getting enough of not establishing a strong enough bridgehead. It's those early days that are the real worry.
Yeah.
It's getting there and then winning that race to build up supplies.
Yeah.
And on paper, it looks like the Germans have got the easier job, but of course they haven't because all the bridges have been destroyed by the air power, Allied air forces, and railways chewed up and all the rest of it. And of course, as we were talking the other day, there's these fighter bombers kind of sort of marauding anyone that moves during daylight,
and their command structure and the people making the decisions
and all of that. But when you're Eisenhower. And when you're Ramsey and when you're Lee Mallory, and not when you're Monty because he's supremely confident, but everyone else is thinking, crikey, this is a very stiff order and the stakes are so high, we can't let it fail. It's a bit like sort of going into a cup final where it's a Cricket World Cup final. You should, you might be favourites on paper.
Yeah, that's England-Pakistan the other day.
Right, but it goes wrong.
Yeah. Okay, Glyn Addison asks... I mean, basically, it would have if D-Day had failed, then the air barons would have gone. All right, we double the size of our bomber capability, and we flatten
everything,
and we
even more than it's already planned.
Even it's already flattened. We bomb the rubble, and we paste Germany into oblivion.
Yeah, and actually, you're right about that. I mean, when you look at the great cities of Germany, look at Berlin at the end of the war. We've all seen those pictures of the Russians at the Reichstag, and we've all seen the pictures of the devastation of Berlin. That is not the Red Army. That's RAF Bomber Command.
Yeah. So Germany would have been starved into submission, and you got the end of World War I all over again, basically. Anyway,
yes.
Hi, Glyn Anderson says, I love the podcast. We have ways of making you talk. Very on brand there, Glyn. Excellent, great stuff. He says as well. Was wondering if you had any insights on what the civilian experience was like for those caught up in the Normandy liberation, bombardment of the beaches and bridges situated near villages, etc. Well, I think terrible is the.
Yeah, it was really bad. Really bad. I mean, 15 to 20,000 dead, 100,000 casualties. So, that's sort of on a par with the Americans and the British and Canadians. I mean, separately.
I mean, more French people are killed in the run-up to D-Day than anyone else.
Yes, it's another. Right? Well, it's another sort of conservatively kind
of transport plan and all that.
Yeah, it's about another 15, 20,000, something like that. I mean, it is quite a lot. I had such an interesting conversation with the other day last Tuesday when I was doing this talk with all these veterans. And I was sitting next to a kind of youngish Frenchman. And I said, look, how do you feel about the fact that so many of your towns and cities were absolutely flattened? I mean, there's a series of colour photographs of Saint-Lô, for example. I mean, everyone talks about Caen, but you look at Saint-Lô, it's absolutely, I mean, it looks like Aleppo.
Yeah.
Which we've all become so familiar and which is the kind of, sort of modern day kind of sort of image of kind of mass destruction of a town. It looks just like that. And I said to him, how do you feel about the fact that the Allies were flattening Perrier and Saint-Lô and Caen and Villers-Bocage, totally flattened. Tilly-sur-Seulles, one house left standing.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, but, you saved 50 million. Yeah. I thought, whoa, that's quite big of you.
Because at the time, a lot of Allied soldiers were sort of, had been told the French would be pleased to see them. And, the Allies did turn up and flatten everything and kill their livestock and there's that going on, and lots of descriptions are of cows, the sound of cows that haven't been milked, howling in pain, and all
yes.
and that you have turned up and disrupted this sort of rural thing, because the Germans obviously were occupying Normandy, but men had been taken away to work in Germany and all that sort of thing. That had happened. But when you actually turn up and bomb the shit out of everything, I mean, it's quite hard to say you're liberating it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've got a series of photographs of French towns and villages, and it's just one after the other, just completely, utterly destroyed. Aulnay-sur-Odon, for example. Aulnay. I mean, you look at this, it's just the town hall is left standing, and the rest of it is just
totally flat.
Totally flat.
Yeah. Yeah. So
anyway, we've
what are we doing now, James?
We've got to wrap up. We've got to wrap up. Really, we've got to do our mystery object.
Yo, lovely.
And in our kind of sort of jacket theme, I brought two jackets this week. So I brought an original M41. So this is an American jacket, standard jacket. And what I think is a bit like the battle dress. You can learn so much from looking at the uniforms
and it's
from
sort
World
of
War II.
bleached out olive green.
Yep, this is OD number 3. Olive,
and it's sort of bomber jacket cut. It's cut to your waist.
Yeah. So what happens in early 1940? General George Marshall, who's the chief of staff of the army in the US, says, "Come on, we're rapidly expanding the size of our army." And the army had been very, very old-fashioned. It was old-fashioned wool tunics, First World War style puttees and sort of Tommy helmets and all the rest of it. And okay, come on, we're building this army. It's going to be a civilian army. We want them to feel at home. We want them to feel like they've got a warm, comfortable uniform, which is good for movement. Let's kick all the other stuff into touch. We want something that looks modern, because America is the most modern nation in the planet.
Yeah.
And so they start looking at civilian wind cheaters, and they trial it with the 5th Division in 1940. And the 5th Division is commanded by Major General James Parsons. And half of his division is up in Alaska and half of them in the Midwest. So they put them in both. And they also want a universal jacket, a jacket that will do for everybody.
Yeah.
So they use, what have they got lots of in America? They've got lots of cotton. So they make it sort of cotton-based with a sort of wool lining. It's this sort of cotton poplin. It's actually water resistant. It's got a zip up. It hasn't got any... it doesn't look particularly martial. It doesn't look particularly military. Just remember, this is 1940 that we're talking about. First comes into service in 1941, and this is a jacket that all guys are issued with in 1944 when they do the invasion of Normandy. It's the bog standard jacket, and you can still wear this. This is the most produced military jacket ever in the history of man. 23 million of them, and loads of them were worn afterwards. T-shirts, chinos, and stuff. It's a good look.
Yeah,
and you can someone like me, with my kind of penchant for World War II jackets, I can get away with wearing this without looking at a total knob.
Yes, I mean, you contrast that with, because we talked...
My German greatcoat.
Oh, yeah, exactly. You can't wear your German greatcoat in public, James. You have to do that in the privacy of your own home.
And even there, it's somewhere quite dark and cavernous.
Yeah, you see... It's only with these epaulettes. Are they what do they call the shoulder straps?
Yep.
Yeah. It's only that really gives away that this might be like a kind of military jacket.
Yeah,
is the thing.
And it comes with wool trousers. And interestingly, they have the buttons for the suspenders. The braces.
Yeah. But
they also have belt hoops as well, because you don't really want to be wearing suspenders if you want to go for a number 2.
Yeah.
You just want to sort of whip down your trousers and get on with it, and so that's where the sort of belts really start coming into.
The zip at this point is cutting edge technology, isn't it?
Yeah. The zips have been. I can't remember when the zips are first invented, but they're not really being used on uniforms until the Americans use them.
Right. Amazing.
But I've also got, this is a new version of the M43. So what they decided in 1942 is that actually they've got too many people with different uniforms.
Right.
So the airborne, they've got their own airborne smocks, for example, their own airborne jump jackets. Then there's the M41. What they want is a kind of universal jacket that can be used by all troops. So they developed this. This is olive drab. This is the M43. And this is olive drab number 7. It's made of cotton sateen. So you can see it looks a little bit kind of sheeny, but that's to help it be a little bit more water resistant. And then it's got the same colour OD3 on the inside, but lots more pockets. And this is supposed to be used by everybody. And what they do provide is a kind of sort of liner, a kind of sort of fur liner that you can put on the inside of it, and a hood that you can use in winter. But it's bog standard. And although there are a few of them being used in Normandy in 1944, it doesn't really become standard issue until the autumn of 1944. It's trialled by 3rd Infantry Division in Anzio,
and that's
enough.
the kind of jacket you see people on CND marches in, isn't it? It's like classic lefty apparel.
And it's changed in the 1960s. There's one a development in the 1950s, and there is one in the 1960s, the M65, which is the famous one they used in Vietnam, which has got the zip. But basically, it's the same, and it's a really, really good jacket. It's really comfortable. It's got room in all the bits that you need, so you can crawl on the ground really easily. It's got lots of room, so you can lift your rifle, your weapon to your chin really easily. Anyway, I have got one here, which we are going to give away at Chalk Valley when we do our live podcast.
Oh, wow.
So there you are, as seen on TV.
One size fits
which isn't
all.
worth very much. Jacket Field M1943. There you go.
Okay, and so that will be on. We'll be posing a question or something.
We'll be doing something on Twitter about how you can get hold of this. But you are going to need to be at the Chalk Valley History Festival on Saturday, the 29th of June. And I think we're doing that at midday.
Yeah, noon. Yes.
From our Jimmy 2.5-ton truck.
Excellent.
And you'll need to be there to get it.
Yeah, yes, you'll need to come and get it. We're not posting it.
But this is an M43, size 44 chest. And
genuine item. Okay.
Genuine item.
Super. Well, we'll see you at Chalk Valley History Festival on the 29th. All you jacket fiends, get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag #WeHaveWays or using the email wehavewayspodcast@gmail.com. And do remember to subscribe, rate and review us, but only if you like the thing, on whichever podcast platform you prefer. Cheerio.
Yep. Pip, pip.